In a world where respect seems to be a forgotten language, sometimes it takes the most unexpected hero to remind us what honor truly means. What happens when a decorated war veteran faces humiliation in broad daylight, and a silent guardian steps forward to deliver justice? This is not just a story about standing up to bullies, it's about the unbreakable bonds of service, the power of respect, and how one moment can change everything for everyone watching. The encounter. The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy street corner in downtown London, where people hurried past each other like ships in the night. Marcus Thompson, a 72-year-old veteran of the Falklands War, slowly made his way down the crowded sidewalk with his walking stick tapping rhythmically against the concrete. His weathered face showed the lines of a man who had seen both the best and worst of humanity, but his eyes still held that spark of dignity that no amount of hardship could extinguish. Marcus wore his old service jacket, the one with faded patches and a small collection of medals that most people would never notice. To him, it wasn't about showing off, it was about remembering the men he served with, the friends he lost, and the promise he made to never forget their sacrifice. The jacket had seen better days, much like Marcus himself, but both carried their scars with quiet pride. As he approached the bus stop, Marcus noticed a group of young men lounging against the wall nearby. They looked to be in their 20s, dressed in expensive clothes and carrying themselves with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having faced real consequences. The leader of the group, a tall man with perfectly styled hair and designer sneakers that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly pension, was talking loudly on his phone about some business deal. The bus was running late, as London buses often do, so Marcus took a seat on the bench to wait. He pulled out a small, worn book from his jacket pocket, a collection of war poetry that he'd carried with him for decades. Reading helped pass the time and kept his mind occupied with better thoughts than the constant ache in his legs from old shrapnel wounds. Everything seemed normal until the young man finished his phone call and turned his attention to the people around him. His eyes landed on Marcus, and something in his expression changed. Perhaps it was the sight of an old man sitting alone, or maybe it was the worn appearance of the veteran's clothes, but whatever it was triggered something ugly in the young man's character. "Look at this old fool," the young man said loudly to his friends, pointing at Marcus. "Sitting there like he owns the place. Probably hasn't worked a day in his life, living off the government like a parasite." Marcus looked up from his book, his calm eyes meeting the young man's aggressive stare. He said nothing, hoping the situation would pass. In his many years, he'd learned that some battles weren't worth fighting, and some people weren't worth the energy it would take to correct them. But the young man wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "I'm talking to you, old man. You think you're special because you're wearing that ridiculous jacket? Those fake medals don't impress anyone. Real men work for a living instead of begging for handouts." The other people at the bus stop began to notice the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable and tried to move away, while others pulled out their phones, though whether to call for help or record what was happening wasn't clear. Marcus slowly closed his book and looked up at the young man with the patience that comes from years of dealing with difficult situations. "I'm not looking for any trouble, son," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the situation. "I'm just waiting for the bus like everyone else." This response seemed to anger the young man even more. "Son. Don't call me son, you worthless old beggar. You probably never served anywhere except the unemployment line. Those medals are probably from a costume shop." The insults hit Marcus harder than any physical blow could have. Not because they hurt his pride, but because they dishonored the memory of every man and woman who had actually served alongside him. He thought of Jimmy Patterson, who died saving 3 wounded soldiers in a foxhole outside Port Stanley. He thought of Sarah Mitchell, the medic who gave her life treating the injured under enemy fire. These were real heroes, and hearing their sacrifice mocked by someone who clearly had never risked anything for anyone else made Marcus's blood boil quietly. Still, he maintained his composure. "I understand you're upset about something," Marcus said, slowly standing up with the help of his walking stick. But, I'd appreciate it if you'd lower your voice. There are other people here. The young man laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the morning air. Oh, you'd appreciate it? Well, I'd appreciate it if freeloaders like you would stop taking money that belongs to people who actually contribute to society. You want respect. Earn it like the rest of us. What the young man didn't know was that Marcus had earned more respect in a single day of service than most people accumulate in a lifetime. He had crawled through mud and blood to pull wounded comrades to safety. He had stood watch through freezing nights so that others could sleep safely. He had faced enemy fire without flinching because that was what duty required. But, Marcus wasn't the type to boast about his service, and he certainly wasn't going to justify his worth to someone who clearly wouldn't understand. The confrontation was escalating, and the other people at the bus stop were becoming more uncomfortable. A few had stepped back, creating a circle around Marcus and his tormentor. The young man seemed to be enjoying the attention, feeding off the audience's discomfort and Marcus's quiet dignity. "Look at him," the young man said to his friends, gesturing dramatically at Marcus. "Probably never worked a real job in his life. Probably spent his whole life taking handouts and pretending to be something special. Those medals are probably plastic, just like his pride." That's when something inside Marcus finally stirred. Not anger at the insults directed toward him, but fury at the disrespect shown to everyone who had ever worn a uniform. He had promised himself long ago that he would never let anyone dishonor the memory of his fallen comrades, no matter what the cost to himself. Marcus straightened up as much as his old frame would allow, looking the young man directly in the eyes. "Those medals," he said quietly, "were earned by better men than you'll ever be. Men who died so that people like you could stand on this street corner and say whatever you please. You don't have to thank us for that freedom, but you will show respect." The young man's face reddened with embarrassment and anger. Being challenged by the old man he'd been trying to humiliate in front of his friends and strangers was clearly not part of his plan. "Respect? From me? You think I owe you something? You think wearing that pathetic costume makes you some kind of hero?" Before Marcus could respond, the young man reached out and roughly grabbed the veteran service jacket, pulling at one of the metal ribbons. "Let's see how real these are," he sneered, trying to tear the decoration from Marcus's chest. The physical assault happened so quickly that most of the onlookers barely had time to process what they were seeing. Marcus, despite his age and physical limitations, tried to step back, but the young man held tight to his jacket, pulling and tugging at the decorations that meant more to the old veteran than his own life. "Let go of me," Marcus said firmly, but his voice carried more weariness than anger. After all these years, after everything he'd been through, to be attacked like this on a public street was almost too much to bear. The young man's friends started laughing and cheering him on, apparently finding the whole situation entertaining. Other bystanders looked on in shock, some pulling out phones to record what was happening, but none stepping forward to help. This was someone else's problem, and they didn't want to get involved. But someone was watching who would soon change everything. Standing across the street, near the entrance to a government building, was James Crawford, a member of the Queen's Guard who was off duty but still carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to protecting what matters most. He had been walking to meet a friend for lunch when he noticed the commotion at the bus stop. At first, James thought it was just another street argument, the kind of thing that happened in busy cities every day. But, as he watched more carefully, he began to understand what was really happening. He saw an elderly man being physically assaulted by someone much younger and stronger. He saw the victim's military bearing, the way he held himself despite being under attack. And, most importantly, he recognized the decorations on the old man's jacket. James had spent years learning to read people, to spot threats, and to understand situations quickly. It was part of his training, part of what made him effective at protecting important people and places. What he saw across the street was not just a random attack, it was a deliberate humiliation of someone who had served their country with honor. The young man was still pulling at Marcus's jacket, trying to rip off the medals while his friends recorded the whole thing on their phones. "Look at this," he was saying to his audience, both live and digital. "Look at this fake soldier pretending to be something special. These medals probably came from a cereal box." Marcus was trying to maintain his dignity while protecting his decorations, but he was clearly overmatched. The physical struggle was taking its toll on his aging body, and the emotional trauma of having his service mocked and his medals treated like toys was visible in his eyes. That's when James made his decision. He had sworn an oath to protect and serve, and that oath didn't end when he took off his uniform. What he was witnessing was an attack on everything he stood for, everything he had dedicated his life to defending. James looked both ways and quickly crossed the busy street, his movements controlled and purposeful. He wasn't running or shouting, that wasn't his way. Instead, he approached with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was going to do and how he was going to do it. The confrontation was still going on when James reached the edge of the crowd that had gathered to watch. The young man was now trying to push Marcus down onto the bench while continuing to grab at his medals. The old veteran was doing his best to resist, but it was clear that he was fighting a losing battle. James took one more moment to assess the situation, making sure he understood exactly what was happening and what needed to be done. Then, he stepped forward into the circle, his presence immediately changing the energy of the entire scene. The young man didn't notice the new arrival at first. He was too focused on his attack and too absorbed in showing off for his friends and the growing crowd of onlookers. But everyone else noticed. There was something about the way James carried himself, something about his bearing and his calm confidence, that made people instinctively step back and pay attention. When James finally spoke, his voice cut through all the noise and confusion like a sword through silk. "That's enough," he said simply, and somehow those two words carried more authority than all the young man's shouting and posturing combined. The attacker looked up, still holding on to Marcus's jacket, and found himself face to face with someone who clearly represented everything he had been mocking. James stood tall and straight, his off-duty clothes unable to hide the military bearing that years of service had built into his very bones. His eyes were calm but intense, and there was something in his expression that made the young man's confident sneer falter for the first time. "I said that's enough," James repeated, and this time there was no mistaking the command in his voice. "Let him go. Now." The entire street corner fell silent, as if the city itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The young man found himself caught between his desire to maintain his aggressive facade and the growing realization that he had just encountered someone who wouldn't be intimidated by his usual tactics. Marcus looked up at his unexpected defender, and, in that moment, a silent communication passed between two men who had both sworn the same oath and lived by the same code. They had never met before, but they recognized each other instantly as brothers in service, bound by something stronger than blood. The confrontation had reached its turning point, and everyone present could sense that what happened next would determine not just the outcome of this particular incident, but something much larger about justice, respect, and the price of standing up for what's right. The young man still held Marcus's jacket in his fist, but his grip was loosening as he stared at James with growing uncertainty. In the distance, a bus was finally approaching the stop, but nobody was thinking about transportation anymore. All eyes were focused on the three men at the center of the drama, waiting to see how this unexpected encounter would resolve itself. The veteran who had served his country with quiet dignity, the bully who thought strength meant picking on the vulnerable, and the guardian who had stepped forward when others had stepped back. The stage was set for a lesson in respect that none of the witnesses would ever forget. The young man's grip on Marcus's jacket slowly loosened as he took in the full measure of the man standing before him. James Crawford wasn't particularly tall or imposing in any obvious way, but there was something about his presence that commanded attention and respect. His shoulders were squared, his posture perfect, and his eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to facing danger without flinching. "Who do you think you are?" the young man finally managed to say, though his voice lacked the confident aggression it had carried just moments before. "This is none of your business." James took a step closer, never breaking eye contact. "When I see a veteran being assaulted on a public street, it becomes my business," he replied calmly. "Now let him go, and we can all walk away from this without any further problems." The young man's friends, who had been laughing and encouraging the harassment just minutes earlier, suddenly found themselves looking uncomfortable. The dynamic had shifted completely, and they were beginning to realize that their leader might have picked a fight with someone who wouldn't back down as easily as an elderly man with a walking stick. "You don't know what you're talking about," the young man said, but his bravado was clearly forced now. "This old man is a fraud, wearing fake medals and pretending to be some kind of hero. Someone needs to expose him for what he really is." James glanced at Marcus, taking in the details of the veteran's decorations with the trained eye of someone who knew military honors when he saw them. The South Atlantic Medal with rosette, indicating service during the Falklands War. The General Service Medal, showing additional deployments. A few campaign medals that spoke of years of faithful service to Crown and country. These weren't costume jewelry from a novelty shop, they were the real thing, earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. "Those medals are genuine," James said quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "And the man wearing them has earned more respect in a single day of service than you've shown in your entire life." The crowd of onlookers was growing larger as word of the confrontation spread. Some people had stopped to watch out of curiosity, others because they sensed that something important was happening. Cell phones were recording from multiple angles, though most of the operators seemed unsure whether they were documenting a crime or witnessing justice in action. Marcus had stepped back slightly when James intervened, but he remained close enough to hear every word. The old veteran was studying his unexpected defender, taking note of the way James carried himself, the way he spoke, and the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him even in civilian clothes. There was no doubt in Marcus's mind that this man had served, and served with distinction. "I don't care what you think those medals represent," the young man said, his voice rising again as he tried to regain control of the situation. "I don't owe either of you anything. This is a free country, and I can say whatever I want to whoever I want." James nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right," he agreed. "This is a free country. And do you know why it's free? Because men like him," he gestured toward Marcus, "were willing to risk everything to keep it that way. They didn't ask for your gratitude, and they certainly didn't ask for your permission to exist. But they do deserve basic human decency." The young man's face was reddening with embarrassment and frustration. Being lectured in front of his friends and a growing crowd of strangers was clearly not how he had planned for this encounter to unfold. He had started the confrontation expecting to easily intimidate an old man and show off for his audience. Instead, he found himself being systematically dismantled by someone who spoke with the quiet authority of absolute moral certainty. "Basic human decency," the young man scoffed, though his heart clearly wasn't in the argument anymore. "What about my rights? What about my freedom of speech? I can say whatever I want about anybody I want." James took another step forward, and, though his movement was controlled and non-threatening, there was something about it that made the young man instinctively step back. "You can say whatever you want," James agreed. "But freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. And physically assaulting an elderly veteran crosses the line from speech into assault." Several people in the crowd murmured their agreement, and the young man seemed to realize for the first time that public opinion was turning against him. What had started as his moment of dominance was becoming a very public humiliation, and his friends were beginning to distance themselves from him both physically and emotionally. "I wasn't assaulting anybody," the young man protested weakly. "I was just checking to see if those medals were real. Anyone can buy that stuff online nowadays." Marcus finally spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. "These medals were earned in the South Atlantic in 1982, he said simply. "I was there when we retook South Georgia Island. I was there when we landed at San Carlos Bay. I was there when good men died far from home, fighting for principles that you clearly don't understand. The effect of Marcus's words on the crowd was immediate and powerful. Several people who had been watching from the sidelines moved closer, their expressions changing from curiosity to something approaching reverence. The elderly man wasn't just wearing old military decorations, he was a living piece of history, a connection to events that had helped shape the world they all lived in. James felt a surge of respect for the veteran's quiet dignity. Marcus could have mentioned his service at any point during the harassment, could have used his war record to try to shame his attacker into backing down. Instead, he had endured the insults and assault in silence, protecting his medals not because of what they meant to him personally, but because of what they represented about the men who hadn't come home. "You hear that?" James said to the young man, his voice carrying an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. This man fought in a real war, against real enemies, for real stakes. While you were probably learning to walk, he was dodging bullets so that you could grow up in a free society. And, this is how you repay that sacrifice. The young man looked around desperately, seeking support from his friends or sympathy from the crowd, but, finding neither. His companions had stepped back far enough to make it clear they weren't part of whatever was about to happen, and, the bystanders were looking at him with expressions ranging from disgust to outright hostility. "Look, I didn't know," the young man said, his voice now carrying a note of panic. "Nobody told me he was really a soldier. How was I supposed to know?" James's expression didn't soften. "You weren't supposed to know," he replied. "You were supposed to treat an elderly man with basic respect regardless of his background. You were supposed to mind your own business instead of attacking someone who couldn't defend himself. You were supposed to act like a decent human being." The moral weight of James's words was crushing, and, the young man seemed to shrink under the combined pressure of public scrutiny and, his own growing awareness of how badly he had misjudged the situation. What had seemed like harmless fun at the expense of a helpless old man had turned into a very public demonstration of his own character flaws. "I want to see you apologize," James continued, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Not because I'm making you, but because it's the right thing to do. This man has earned more respect than you can possibly understand, and, the least you can do is acknowledge that you were wrong." The young man looked back and forth between James and Marcus, clearly struggling with his pride and his growing realization that he had no good options left. His friends had abandoned him, the crowd was against him, and his attempt at intimidation had backfired spectacularly. Apologizing would mean admitting he was wrong in front of dozens of witnesses, but refusing might make things even worse. Marcus watched this internal struggle with the patience of someone who had seen much worse conflicts resolved through much greater struggles. He had no desire to humiliate the young man further, but he also understood that some lessons could only be learned through public accountability. "It's okay," Marcus said quietly to James. "He's young. He doesn't understand what he's doing." But, James shook his head. "Age isn't an excuse for cruelty," he replied. "And, ignorance isn't an excuse for assault. If he's old enough to attack a veteran on a public street, he's old enough to face the consequences of that choice." The bus that Marcus had been waiting for finally arrived at the stop, its brakes hissing as it pulled up to the curb. The driver, an elderly Jamaican man who had been watching the confrontation through his windshield, opened the doors but made no move to rush his passengers. He had seen enough of life to recognize the difference between a simple delay and a moment of genuine importance. Several people in the crowd began moving toward the bus, but most remained where they were, sensing that the confrontation hadn't reached its conclusion yet. The young man was still standing in the center of the circle, looking increasingly desperate as he realized that his options were rapidly narrowing. "I'm sorry," he finally said, though the words came out grudgingly and without much conviction. "I didn't mean to. I didn't realize." James wasn't satisfied. "You didn't realize what?" he pressed. "That elderly people deserve respect. That veterans have earned their honors. That assault is against the law. What exactly didn't you realize? The young man's face was burning with embarrassment now, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I didn't realize he was a real soldier, he admitted. I thought he was just pretending. Marcus felt a mixture of sadness and understanding wash over him. In a way, he could see how someone with no connection to the military might not understand the significance of the medals and decorations. The gap between civilian and military life had grown so wide that many people had no frame of reference for understanding what service really meant. Even if I wasn't a soldier, Marcus said gently, did I deserve to be treated that way? Would it have been acceptable to assault me if I was just an ordinary pensioner waiting for a bus? The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing the young man to confront not just his ignorance about military service, but his fundamental assumptions about how people should treat each other. The crowd waited in silence for his response, and even his friends seemed to be paying attention for the first time. No, the young man admitted reluctantly. I guess it wouldn't have been okay regardless. James nodded approvingly. Now you're starting to understand, he said. This isn't just about respecting veterans, though you should definitely do that. This is about respecting all people, especially those who can't defend themselves. The lesson was beginning to sink in, and the young man's entire demeanor had changed from aggressive to ashamed. He looked at Marcus with something approaching genuine remorse. I really am sorry, he said, and this time the words carried real sincerity. I was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. Marcus studied the young man's face carefully, looking for signs of genuine contrition rather than mere expedience. What he saw was someone who was genuinely beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake, someone who might actually learn from this experience rather than simply trying to escape from it. Apology accepted, Marcus said simply, extending his hand toward the young man. But, I hope you'll remember this moment the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on appearances. The young man stared at the offered hand for a moment, seemingly amazed that forgiveness was being offered after everything that had happened. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and shook Marcus's hand, and, in that gesture, something important passed between them. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate tension dissolved, though many people lingered to catch a few more words or to approach Marcus directly. Several veterans in the crowd had identified themselves and wanted to shake hands with both Marcus and James. A few civilians approached to express their gratitude for the service of both men. James watched these interactions with satisfaction, knowing that the real lesson of the day wasn't just for the young man who had started the confrontation, but for everyone who had witnessed it. People had seen what it meant to stand up for what's right, to protect those who can't protect themselves, and to treat others with the dignity that every human being deserves. But, as the crowd slowly dispersed and normal life began to resume on the busy street corner, James realized that the most important part of the story was just beginning. The confrontation was over, but the real transformation, both for the young man who had learned a hard lesson and for everyone who had witnessed it, was still unfolding. Marcus finally boarded his bus, turning back to wave at James before the doors closed. The two men had never met before this moment, and they might never meet again, but they had shared something that would connect them forever, the knowledge that when the moment came to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right, they had both chosen correctly. The bus pulled away from the curb, carrying Marcus toward whatever mundane destination had brought him to that street corner in the first place. But, for everyone who had witnessed the encounter, the morning had become anything but mundane. They had seen ordinary people rise to extraordinary moments, and they would carry that memory with them long after the details of the confrontation faded. As the bus disappeared around the corner, carrying Marcus away from the scene of the confrontation, the atmosphere on the street corner remained charged with emotional energy. James stood where he was for a few more moments, watching the dispersing crowd and thinking about what had just occurred. He had acted on instinct, responding to a situation that demanded intervention, but now he was beginning to understand that the consequences of his actions would extend far beyond this single morning. The young man who had started the whole incident remained standing near the bus stop, looking lost and confused. His friends had already begun walking away, clearly uncomfortable with their association with someone who had just been so publicly humiliated. They whispered among themselves as they departed, occasionally glancing back at their former leader with expressions that mixed embarrassment with disappointment. "Wait," the young man called after them, but they didn't stop. Within moments, he found himself alone except for James and a few lingering bystanders who were still processing what they had witnessed. The confident aggressor who had been tormenting an elderly veteran just minutes earlier now looked like nothing more than a confused and frightened young man who was beginning to realize the true cost of his actions. James observed this transformation with interest rather than satisfaction. He had no desire to see the young man suffer unnecessarily, but he understood that some lessons could only be learned through genuine consequences. The social isolation that was already beginning to manifest was a natural result of the young man's choices, and it might prove to be the most effective teacher he could have. "They'll come back," the young man said, though his voice lacked conviction. They need some time to cool off." James looked at him with something approaching sympathy. "Maybe they will," he agreed. "But, even if they don't, that might not be the worst thing that could happen to you." "What do you mean?" the young man asked, genuinely confused. "I mean that friends who would encourage you to assault an elderly veteran might not be the kind of friends you need in your life," James replied. "Real friends would have stopped you from making that mistake in the first place." This observation hit the young man like a physical blow. He had never thought about the nature of his friendships in those terms, had never questioned whether the people he surrounded himself with brought out his best qualities or his worst. The realization that his companions might have been leading him toward destructive behavior rather than away from it was both painful and illuminating. Several members of the crowd approached James to thank him for his intervention. An elderly woman who had been waiting for the same bus as Marcus expressed her gratitude for his willingness to step forward when others had remained silent. A middle-aged businessman who had recorded part of the confrontation on his phone asked for James's contact information, saying he wanted to send him the video in case it might be useful for anything. "I'm not looking for recognition," James told him politely. "But, if that video helps remind people to treat each other with respect, then, I'm glad you recorded it." The businessman nodded enthusiastically. "I've never seen anything like that," he said. "The way you handled that situation, the way you stood up for that old soldier, it was inspiring. Made me think about whether I would have had the courage to do the same thing." James shook his head. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's doing what's right despite the fear. And, everyone has that capacity if they choose to use it." As these conversations continued around him, the young man found himself increasingly isolated, listening to strangers praise the man who had confronted him while completely ignoring his presence. It was a stark reminder of how quickly public opinion could shift, and how dramatically one's social standing could change based on a single set of choices. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who had been walking to work when she witnessed the confrontation, approached James with a thoughtful expression. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," she began, "but what you did back there was more than just intervention. It was education. You didn't just stop the harassment, you helped everyone here understand why it was wrong." James appreciated the observation. "That's kind of you to say. I just did what seemed necessary." "But, that's exactly my point," Dr. Chen continued. "You saw what needed to be done, and you did it without hesitation. Most people would have found reasons to avoid getting involved. They would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem, or that someone else would handle it, or that they didn't want to make things worse." The conversation was being overheard by several other bystanders, including the young man who had started the trouble. He found himself listening to strangers analyze his behavior and James's response with the detached interest of academic observers studying a social phenomenon. It was deeply uncomfortable to be discussed as a case study in poor decision-making, but it was also educational in ways he was only beginning to understand. A teenager who had been walking to school when he stopped to watch the confrontation approached James nervously. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did. My grandfather was in the army, and I know he would have appreciated seeing someone stand up for that old man." James smiled at the young person's politeness and sincerity. "Your grandfather would be proud of you for recognizing what was happening and caring about it," he replied. "That's the kind of awareness and empathy that makes the difference between a good person and a great one." The teenager glowed with pride at the compliment, and James realized that his actions were already beginning to influence people he had never expected to reach. The ripple effects of standing up for what was right were spreading outward in ways that might continue long after this particular morning was forgotten. As the immediate crowd began to disperse, James noticed that the young man was still standing nearby, apparently uncertain about what to do next. His friends were gone, his confidence was shattered, and he seemed genuinely lost. Against his better judgment, James found himself feeling sympathy for someone who was clearly struggling with the consequences of his own poor choices. "Are you all right?" James asked, approaching the young man with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. The young man looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting any kind of concern from the man who had just systematically dismantled his aggressive facade. I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I feel like everything I thought I knew about myself just got turned upside down." James nodded understandingly. "That's not necessarily a bad thing," he said. "Sometimes we need to have our assumptions challenged in order to become better people. The question is what you're going to do with this experience." "I don't even know where to start," the young man replied. "How do you come back from something like this? How do you face people after they've seen you act like that?" "You start by making sure it never happens again," James said simply. "You think about why you acted that way, what led up to it, and what you can change about yourself to prevent it from happening in the future. And then, you work every day to be the kind of person you want to be rather than the kind of person you were this morning." The advice was both practical and philosophical, and the young man seemed to be genuinely considering it. For the first time since the confrontation began, his expression showed something other than anger, embarrassment, or confusion. There was a hint of hope there, a suggestion that he might be beginning to see this humiliating experience as an opportunity for growth rather than simply a disaster to be survived. "Do you think he'll forgive me?" the young man asked suddenly. "The old soldier, I mean. Do you think he really meant it when he accepted my apology?" James considered the question carefully. "Marcus is a better man than most," he replied, using the veteran's name for the first time. "If he says he forgives you, then he means it. But forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, and it doesn't remove your responsibility to learn from it." "Marcus," the young man repeated. "I never even asked his name. I just saw an old man and decided he was. God, I can't even say what I thought about him. It's too awful." "The fact that you recognize how awful it was is actually a good sign," James pointed out. "It means you're capable of growth and change. The question is whether you're willing to do the work that growth requires." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a police officer who had been called to the scene by someone who witnessed the original harassment. Constable Williams had been walking his beat when he received the radio call about a disturbance at the bus stop, but by the time he arrived, the situation had already been resolved. "I understand there was some kind of altercation here," the officer said, looking back and forth between James and the young man. "Is everyone all right? Do we need to file any reports?" James looked to the young man, giving him the opportunity to speak for himself. After a moment of hesitation, the young man stepped forward. "There was a problem, officer, but it's been resolved. I was harassing an elderly gentleman, and this man," he gestured toward James, "helped me understand that what I was doing was wrong." Constable Williams raised an eyebrow at this unusually honest confession. In his experience, most people involved in street confrontations tried to minimize their own responsibility and exaggerate the other party's guilt. Hearing someone voluntarily admit to wrongdoing was both refreshing and suspicious. "And you're comfortable with that resolution?" the officer asked James. "You don't feel the need to press charges or file a complaint?" James shook his head. The situation was handled appropriately, he said. Sometimes education is more effective than punishment. The officer made a few notes in his notebook, but it was clear that he wasn't planning to take any official action. The combination of James's calm authority and the young man's apparent remorse suggested that whatever had happened, it had been resolved in a way that served everyone's interests. "Well, if everyone's satisfied, then, I suppose we can consider the matter closed," Constable Williams said. "But, I'd like to remind everyone that physical harassment is still against the law, regardless of how it gets resolved. Next time, we might not be so lucky to have someone around who can talk sense into the situation." The warning was clearly directed at the young man, who nodded soberly. "Yes, sir. I understand. It won't happen again." As the police officer departed, James prepared to leave as well. He had already been late for his lunch appointment, and he needed to contact his friend to explain the delay. But, before he could go, the young man stopped him with one final question. "Why did you help me?" he asked. "After everything I did, after the way I acted, why did you take the time to talk to me instead of just walking away?" James thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Because everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moment," he said. "You made a terrible mistake, but that doesn't mean you have to be defined by it for the rest of your life. What matters now is what you choose to do next." With that, James walked away, leaving the young man standing alone at the bus stop with a great deal to think about. The morning's events had lasted less than an hour, but they had set in motion a series of changes that would continue to unfold for weeks and months to come. The young man remained at the bus stop for several more minutes, processing everything that had happened and trying to understand how his morning had gone so completely wrong. Eventually, he pulled out his phone and began making a call, though whether he was trying to contact his departed friends or someone else entirely wasn't clear to the few remaining bystanders. What was clear was that the confrontation had fundamentally changed everyone who witnessed it. Some had learned about courage and intervention, others about respect and dignity, and still others about the power of forgiveness and second chances. The ripple effects were already spreading outward, carried by the dozens of people who had seen what happened and would undoubtedly share their stories with friends, family members, and colleagues. In a world where negative news and destructive behavior often dominated the headlines, the morning's event served as a reminder that ordinary people were still capable of extraordinary decency when the situation demanded it. The story would be retold in homes and offices, shared on social media, and remembered whenever someone faced their own moment of choice between standing up and standing aside. The true measure of the morning's impact wouldn't be known for days or weeks to come, as the people who witnessed it carried their memories forward and allowed them to influence their own future choices. But, one thing was certain, everyone who had been there would remember the day they saw a royal guard stand up for a veteran, and they would remember that sometimes, doing the right thing really can make all the difference in the world. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the bus stop, and the effects of that morning continued to ripple outward through the lives of everyone who had been touched by it. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading through social media, workplace conversations, and family dinner tables. Videos of the encounter had been shared thousands of times, always accompanied by discussions about respect, service, and the courage to do what's right. Marcus Thompson had returned to his daily routine, but his experience that morning had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. The attempted humiliation had reminded him that his service and sacrifice still mattered to people, that there were still those willing to stand up for what was right. The encounter with James had reinforced his faith in the younger generation, proving that honor and duty weren't forgotten values but living principles that continued to guide good people in their daily choices. The veteran had received dozens of messages from people who had seen the videos or heard the story secondhand. Fellow veterans reached out to share their own experiences and express their gratitude for his dignity under pressure. Civilians wrote to thank him for his service and to tell him that his example had inspired them to treat others with greater respect and kindness. One particularly moving message came from a teacher in Birmingham who had shown the video to her students as part of a lesson on citizenship and character. "Your calm strength in the face of disrespect has helped my students understand what real dignity looks like," she wrote. "They've been discussing your example for days, and several have told me they want to serve their country when they're older because they want to be the kind of person you are." Marcus kept these messages in a small box beside his chair, reading them whenever he felt discouraged about the state of the world. They served as tangible proof that individual acts of decency could still inspire others, that standing up for principles still mattered even when it seemed like society was moving away from traditional values. James Crawford had also been profoundly affected by the morning's events, though in different ways. As a member of the Royal Guard, he was accustomed to being seen as a symbol of duty and honor, but the encounter at the bus stop had reminded him that these symbols only had meaning when they translated into action in real-world situations. Standing up for Marcus hadn't been part of his official duties, but it had been entirely consistent with everything his uniform represented. The incident had also sparked conversations within his unit about the broader meaning of their service. During a training session the following week, James had shared the story with his fellow guardsmen, leading to a deep discussion about their responsibilities both on and off duty. Several of his colleagues expressed regret about times they had witnessed unfairness or disrespect without intervening, and they committed to being more active in standing up for vulnerable people in their daily lives. "We don't stop being guardsmen when we take off the uniform," James had told them. "The oath we swore extends beyond protecting buildings and ceremonies. It's about protecting the values those buildings and ceremonies represent." The response from his superiors had been uniformly positive. Far from being concerned about James getting involved in a street confrontation, they praised his judgment and his restraint. The incident had become a teaching moment throughout the military hierarchy, an example of how to handle difficult situations with both firmness and dignity. But, perhaps the most dramatic transformation had occurred in the life of the young man who had started the whole confrontation. David Mitchell, as he had eventually introduced himself to James when he sought him out a week later, had spent the intervening time engaged in deep self-reflection and genuine efforts at personal change. The immediate aftermath of the bus stop incident had been brutal for David. The videos of his harassment of Marcus had gone viral, and his face had become associated with everything ugly about bullying and disrespect for veterans. His social media accounts had been flooded with angry messages, his employer had called him in for a disciplinary meeting, and several of his friends and family members had expressed their disappointment and embarrassment about his behavior. The initial shock and humiliation had been overwhelming, but, as the days passed, David began to see the situation differently. Instead of focusing on how unfairly he felt he was being treated, he started to examine the choices that had led him to that moment. The process was painful but necessary, forcing him to confront aspects of his personality and behavior that he had never previously questioned. David realized that his aggression toward Marcus hadn't emerged from nowhere. It was the culmination of years of treating people poorly whenever he thought he could get away with it, of using his relative youth and strength to intimidate those he perceived as vulnerable. The bus stop incident had simply been the most visible and consequential example of a pattern of behavior that had been developing for years. With this recognition came a determination to change. David began reading about empathy and emotional intelligence, trying to understand why he had been drawn to aggressive behavior and how he could develop healthier ways of relating to other people. He volunteered at a local veterans organization, hoping to learn more about military service and to find ways to make amends for his disrespectful treatment of Marcus. The volunteer work proved to be transformational in ways David hadn't expected. Working with elderly veterans forced him to confront the reality of service and sacrifice in deeply personal ways. He heard stories of young men and women who had given up comfortable lives to serve their country, who had endured hardships and dangers that David could barely imagine, who had lost friends and comrades in service to principles larger than themselves. One veteran in particular, a 90-year-old named Albert who had served in World War II, took David under his wing and helped him understand the broader context of military service. Albert had been at D-Day, had fought through France and into Germany, had witnessed both the best and worst of human nature during the most consequential conflict in modern history. "The young man I was before the war wouldn't have recognized the man I became afterward," Albert told David during one of their long conversations. "War changes you, but so does any experience that forces you to confront what really matters. The question isn't whether you'll be changed by difficult experiences, the question is whether you'll allow those changes to make you better or worse." David found himself thinking about Albert's words constantly. The bus stop incident had certainly been a difficult experience, one that had forced him to confront what really mattered in ways he never had before. The question was whether he would allow that experience to make him better or worse. Gradually, David began to understand that the path forward required more than just avoiding similar confrontations in the future. It required actively working to become the kind of person who would never have started that confrontation in the first place. This meant developing empathy for others, learning to see situations from different perspectives, and cultivating the kind of inner strength that expressed itself through kindness rather than aggression. The process was neither quick nor easy. David found himself catching his own thoughts and impulses throughout the day, questioning whether his reactions to various situations reflected his old patterns or his emerging new understanding. He practiced treating service workers with respect, made efforts to help elderly neighbors with their shopping, and gradually rebuilt his social relationships on foundations of mutual respect rather than shared meanness. 1 month after the original incident, David worked up the courage to reach out to Marcus directly. He had obtained the veterans' contact information through the veterans organization where he volunteered, and, after several drafts, he sent a carefully written letter expressing his continued remorse and his efforts to become a better person. Marcus's response was both gracious and encouraging. The veteran acknowledged David's efforts at self-improvement and offered to meet with him if David thought it would be helpful. When they finally sat down together at a quiet cafe, their conversation lasted nearly 3 hours and covered everything from military history to personal growth to the nature of forgiveness. "I was angry at you for a while," Marcus admitted during their meeting. "Not because of what you said to me, but because of what your attitude represented. It seemed like proof that everything we had fought for, all the sacrifices that had been made, weren't valued or understood by the generation that benefited from them." David listened carefully, understanding that Marcus was sharing something deeply personal and painful. "I can't change what I did," he replied, "but I can promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the freedoms you and your comrades secured for people like me." The meeting marked a turning point for both men. Marcus gained renewed faith in the capacity for redemption and growth, while David received the forgiveness and encouragement he needed to continue his difficult journey of personal transformation. The story of their reconciliation, when it eventually became public, added another layer to the ongoing conversation about the original incident. People were fascinated by the idea that genuine change was possible, that even someone who had acted so poorly could learn and grow from their mistakes. Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychiatrist who had witnessed the original confrontation, wrote an article for a psychology journal analyzing the various elements that had made positive change possible in David's case. She identified several key factors: the public nature of his humiliation, which made denial impossible, the intervention of James, which provided a model of better behavior, the opportunity for meaningful service through his volunteer work, and, most importantly, his own willingness to engage in honest self-reflection. "Change is always possible," Dr. Chen wrote, "but it requires both external circumstances that make change necessary and internal characteristics that make change achievable." In this case, we saw both elements come together in ways that allowed genuine transformation to occur. The article sparked further discussion in academic and professional circles about the nature of redemption and the possibility for people to fundamentally alter their character through conscious effort and supportive circumstances. The bus stop incident had become more than just a viral video, it had become a case study in human potential and the power of second chances. Meanwhile, James continued his service with renewed appreciation for the broader meaning of his duties. The incident had reminded him that representing his country meant more than just standing guard at important buildings or participating in ceremonial events. It meant embodying the values of service, honor, and protection in every aspect of his life. He had received commendations from his superiors and praise from the public, but the recognition that meant the most to him came from his grandmother, a woman who had lived through World War II and understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. "Your grandfather would have been proud," she told him over Sunday dinner. "Not because you were brave, he knew you were brave already. But because you understood that real courage isn't about fighting enemies on a battlefield. It's about standing up for what's right in everyday situations, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable." The wisdom of her words stayed with James long after their conversation ended. He realized that the bus stop incident had taught him something important about the nature of his calling. Being a guardian wasn't just a job or even a vocation, it was a way of approaching the world that extended into every aspect of his life. As spring turned to summer, the immediate intensity of the bus stop incident began to fade, but its lessons continued to influence the lives of everyone it had touched. Marcus resumed his quiet routine but carried himself with renewed pride in his service. James continued his duties with deeper understanding of their broader meaning. David persevered in his efforts at personal transformation, supported by new relationships and a clearer sense of purpose. The story itself had become part of London folklore, shared and retold whenever people needed reminding that individual actions still mattered, that standing up for what's right could still make a difference, and that even the most unlikely people were capable of profound change when circumstances demanded it and character allowed it. But the true measure of the story's impact wouldn't be found in its viral popularity or academic analysis. It would be found in the thousands of small moments when people who had heard it chose kindness over cruelty, intervention over indifference, and hope over cynicism. The ripple effects continued to spread outward, creating new stories of courage and compassion that honored the example set that morning at a busy London bus stop. 6 months after the confrontation at the London bus stop, the story had evolved from a viral internet sensation into something much more significant, a touchstone for discussions about respect, courage, and the possibility of redemption that continued to influence people across the country and beyond. What had begun as a chance encounter between 3 strangers had become a powerful reminder that individual actions still mattered in an increasingly complex world. The anniversary of the incident approached with unexpected fanfare. A local news station decided to do a follow-up story, tracking down the main participants and exploring how their lives had changed in the intervening months. What they discovered was a series of transformations that went far beyond what anyone could have predicted on that spring morning when everything began. Marcus Thompson had become something of a reluctant celebrity in veteran circles, frequently invited to speak at military events and community gatherings. His message was always the same: service doesn't end when you take off the uniform, and dignity in the face of adversity is itself a form of continued service to the values you once swore to defend. At a particularly moving ceremony at the Imperial War Museum, Marcus addressed an audience of veterans, active service members, and civilian supporters. "What happened to me that morning wasn't really about me," he told them. "It was about all of us who have served, and all of those who support us. When James stood up for me, he was standing up for every person who has ever worn a uniform in service to something greater than themselves." The speech was recorded and shared widely, adding another layer to the ongoing conversation about the incident. Veterans across the country reached out to share their own stories of both disrespect and support, creating a national dialogue about how society treats those who have served. Marcus had also used his unexpected platform to advocate for better support services for elderly veterans. He testified before Parliament about the challenges facing aging service members, from healthcare access to social isolation to the simple human need for recognition and respect. His testimony, informed by both his personal experience and the hundreds of letters he had received from fellow veterans, led to increased funding for veteran support programs and greater public awareness of the issues facing older service members. "I never asked to be a spokesman for anyone," Marcus reflected during the news interview. "But, if my experience can help other veterans feel valued and respected, then something good will have come from what was intended to be a humiliating experience." James Crawford had also found his life changed in unexpected ways. The military had recognized his actions with a commendation for demonstrating the values of service even while off duty, but, more importantly, he had discovered a passion for community outreach and education. Working with his commanding officers, James had developed a program that brought active service members into schools and community centers to talk about citizenship, respect, and the importance of standing up for others. The program, called Guardians in the Community, had been so successful that it was being expanded nationwide. James found himself traveling throughout the UK, speaking to young people about the values that military service both instilled and protected. His message resonated particularly strongly with teenagers, who appreciated his authentic approach and his willingness to discuss both the privileges and responsibilities that came with living in a free society. Young people today face a lot of pressure and confusion, James explained to the news reporter. They're told constantly about their rights, but not as much about their responsibilities to each other. Military service taught me that real strength comes from protecting others, not from dominating them. If we can help young people understand that lesson without requiring them to go through military training, we'll all be better off. The success of the community outreach program had led to James being offered a position in military education when his current service commitment ended. It was an opportunity to make the principles he lived by part of his professional mission, and he was seriously considering accepting the role. But, perhaps the most dramatic transformation had occurred in David Mitchell's life. The young man who had started the confrontation as an arrogant bully had emerged 6 months later as a passionate advocate for veterans' rights and a living example of the possibility for personal redemption. David's volunteer work with elderly veterans had evolved into a full-time commitment. He had left his previous job in finance and taken a position with a national veterans charity, focusing specifically on combating isolation and discrimination faced by aging service members. His personal experience with the consequences of disrespecting veterans gave him unique insight into the problem and unusual credibility when addressing it. "I can speak to people about this issue because I was the problem," David explained during his portion of the news interview. "I know what it's like to look at an elderly person and see only weakness or irrelevance. I understand the mindset that leads people to treat veterans poorly because I lived in that mindset for years. And I know how wrong and destructive that attitude is because I've experienced the consequences firsthand." David's transformation had been noticed by other organizations working with at-risk youth and people struggling with anger management. He had begun speaking to groups about his experience, sharing his story as an example of how even the most seemingly irredeemable behavior could be changed through honest self-reflection and committed effort. His relationship with Marcus had continued to develop over the months, evolving from awkward apology to genuine friendship. The two men met regularly for coffee, discussing everything from military history to personal growth to current events. Marcus had become something of a mentor to David, helping him understand not just the specific harm he had caused but the broader context of service and sacrifice that gave meaning to veterans' experiences. "Marcus saved my life," David said during the interview, his voice carrying obvious emotion. "Not in a dramatic way, but in the sense that he helped me become a person I could actually respect. Before that morning, I was heading down a path that would have led to a life of cruelty and emptiness. He and James showed me that there was another way to be strong, another way to matter in the world." The news story also explored the broader impact the incident had on the people who witnessed it and the millions who saw the videos online. Social media analysis showed that discussions about the incident had led to increased volunteer sign-ups at veterans organizations across the country. Schools reported more students expressing interest in military service, while community organizations noted increased participation in programs focused on helping elderly and vulnerable populations. Dr. Sarah Chen had continued her research into the incident and its aftermath, publishing a book about the psychology of viral moments and their potential for inspiring positive social change. Her analysis suggested that the bus stop confrontation had resonated so powerfully because it represented several archetypal narratives: the vulnerable elder, the protective guardian, the redeemed antagonist, and the community that bears witness to both wrongdoing and justice. This story spoke to fundamental human needs, Dr. Chen explained in the news report. The need to see justice done, the need to believe in redemption, and the need to feel that individual actions still matter in a complex world. It provided a kind of moral clarity that people rarely experience in their daily lives. The academic community had taken notice of Dr. Chen's work, leading to conferences and symposiums about the role of viral media in shaping social values. The bus stop incident had become a case study taught in sociology and psychology courses, an example of how modern technology could amplify traditional moral narratives in ways that influenced real-world behavior. The ripple effects extended into unexpected areas as well. The London Transport Authority had used the incident as motivation for a system-wide campaign about respectful behavior on public transportation. Posters featuring the message, "Respect every journey," appeared throughout the transit system, reminding passengers that everyone deserved to travel with dignity and safety. Several schools had incorporated the story into their citizenship curricula, using it as a starting point for discussions about respect, courage, and personal responsibility. Teachers reported that students were particularly engaged by the idea that ordinary people could become heroes simply by choosing to do what was right when the moment demanded it. The incident had also inspired artistic responses. A local theater company had developed a one-act play based on the events, using the story to explore themes of duty, redemption, and the courage required to intervene in difficult situations. The play had been performed at schools and community centers throughout the region, always followed by discussions about the choices people face in their daily lives. A documentary filmmaker had approached all three main participants about creating a longer-form exploration of their story and its aftermath. While Marcus and James had been hesitant about additional publicity, David had embraced the opportunity to share his transformation more widely, hoping that his example might inspire others to examine their own behavior and make positive changes. If my story can help one person avoid making the mistakes I made, or help someone understand that they can change no matter how far they've fallen, then all the embarrassment and difficulty will have been worth it, David said when explaining his decision to participate in the documentary. As the 6-month anniversary of the incident arrived, the three men found themselves together again, this time by choice rather than chance. They met at the same bus stop where everything had begun, joined by several dozen other people who had been touched by their story in various ways. Veterans came to thank Marcus for his dignity and grace under pressure. Young people came to meet James and learn about service and courage. People struggling with their own behavioral challenges came to hear David talk about the possibility of change and redemption. The gathering was informal and unplanned, organized through social media by people who felt connected to the story and wanted to mark its anniversary. What emerged was a community celebration of the values that the incident had represented: respect for service, courage in the face of injustice, and hope for human transformation. Marcus spoke briefly to the gathered crowd, emphasizing that the real heroes of the story were all the people who had chosen to be inspired rather than simply entertained by what had happened. "You could have watched the videos and moved on with your lives," he said. "Instead, you chose to let our experience change how you treat other people. That's the real victory here." James echoed these sentiments, noting that the incident had value only to the extent that it inspired others to act with courage and compassion in their own lives. "We're not special people," he said. "We just found ourselves in a situation where the right choice was clear. All of you face similar choices every day. The question is whether you'll make them based on convenience or on principle." David's remarks were the most emotional of the three. "6 months ago, I was the person everyone here would have disapproved of," he said. "I was cruel, selfish, and proud of my ability to intimidate others. I'm standing here today as proof that no one has to remain the person they were yesterday. Change is possible, but it requires both the courage to admit your mistakes and the commitment to do better." The anniversary gathering received significant media coverage, but, more importantly, it demonstrated that the impact of the original incident continued to grow and evolve. People had been inspired not just by the dramatic confrontation they had witnessed, but by the ongoing commitment of all three participants to live according to the principles that had emerged from their encounter. As evening approached and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus, James, and David found themselves alone at the bus stop once again. They reflected on how their lives had changed since that spring morning, and on the unexpected ways their story had touched so many other people. "Do you think it will last?" David asked. "The impact, I mean. Will people remember this story next year, or in 5 years?" Marcus smiled. "The story itself might be forgotten," he said. "But the choices people have made because of it, the kindness they've shown, the courage they've found, those things will last forever. And they'll inspire other choices and other acts of courage that have nothing to do with us." James nodded in agreement. "We were just the catalyst," he said. "The real story is being written by everyone who decided to be a little braver, a little kinder, a little more willing to stand up for what's right because of what they saw or heard about us." As they parted ways that evening, each man carried with him the knowledge that their chance encounter had become something much larger than any of them could have imagined. They had learned that individual actions really did matter, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary courage, and that the possibility of redemption existed even in the most unlikely circumstances. The bus stop returned to its normal function as a transit point for everyday commuters, but it would never be quite ordinary again. A small plaque had been installed by the local council, not commemorating the specific incident but honoring the general principle it represented, in memory of all who stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. The inscription served as a quiet reminder that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but about the daily choice to treat others with dignity and to intervene when that dignity was threatened. It was a lesson that had emerged from a moment of crisis but had relevance for every moment that followed, a reminder that the measure of a society could be found in how its strongest members treated its most vulnerable. The story of the bus stop confrontation had officially ended, but the stories it inspired continued to unfold every day in countless small acts of courage, kindness, and respect. The true legacy of that spring morning wasn't to be found in viral videos or news coverage, but in the changed lives of everyone who had chosen to let the incident inspire them to be better versions of themselves. In the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that meaning wasn't created by dramatic events themselves, but by how ordinary people chose to respond to those events and carry their lessons forward into the future. The confrontation between a bully, a veteran, and a guardian had lasted only minutes, but its impact would continue for generations, carried forward by everyone who had witnessed it and decided to make their own stand for what was right.